hosting today's event with the Coalition for Global Prosperity, with a debate on foreign aid and should charity start at home. We've got an excellent panel of speakers. Tom Hunt, the MP for Ipswich, Ryan Henson, who's the Chief Executive Officer at the Coalition for Global Prosperity, Emily Carver, presenter at GB News, and Latika Burke, a journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald. So, with government budgets under pressure, should the UK be looking to restore its foreign aid spending to 0.7% of gross national income? Does overseas aid and development represent value for money, or are there more deserving causes at home? We'll unpack all of those questions, and I'm sure many more as we go through the session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to Tom, actually, to kick things off for us. So, Tom Hunt.
Thank you very much. So international aid has already gone down from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% of GDP, something which I supported. I do think there's a role for international aid budget. I think ultimately we've got to try and take the country with us, and I think there's a big piece of work to be done about trying to communicate to the public the benefits of that international aid, both in terms from a moral perspective, but also from a sort of enlightened self-interest perspective. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. I think it's not unreasonable to listen to the British public, and if they're not particularly supportive of something, you should try and take them with you, and if not, you want to listen to them. So I was very sceptical about writing the international aid budget into a law as a certain percentage of GDP as well. I thought that was not a particularly good thing to do, and not a particularly good thing to do with anything, particularly when you don't know what's in the future in terms of the economic climate and the different pulls on the public purse.
Well, why do you think that there's such a disparity between the sort of what the political class feel about international aid versus what voters might feel about international aid?
Well, I think it's like lots of things. I mean, what you read about in the media are often the kind of when a small number of cases where maybe international aid hasn't been spent in the best way. That is what you'll read about. You won't always. It's not always as interesting to read about the countless examples of international aid saving lives, making a huge difference to some of the most vulnerable people in the world. I was, at the time I've been a member of Parliament, 3 times I've been to the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, for example, and actually the aid which we're putting into the Rohingya camp has actually gone down, even though the demand has gone up. I saw in a very real sense what that meant in terms of the allocation of food that a family would get, the food it would get, and a very real life difference that's making in terms of some of the most desperate people in the world having less nourishment, less food. And so I think actually if we could find ways of communicating those real facts in a powerful way, I think we could take the public with us. More so than we have done currently.
Okay, let's move on to Latika Burke.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on your panel. I think there is a very strong case for Britain to be contributing foreign aid. I'm less wedded to the idea whether it's 0.5% of GNI compared to 0.7, but I do think it's good to have a target because that gives people who spend and allocate this money a framework. It's just the same as you or I budgeting for our finances every year. You need to know how much you're spending and where you can allocate that. So I think that makes sense. The case for spending foreign aid is, I think, actually less moral now than it's ever been. It's more strategic. It is in Britain's security and strategic interests for it to project its influence on the global stage, for it to be able to talk to countries that it wants to convince and bring to the table on other issues, say Ukraine. A perfect example. There are plenty of countries, a lot of them poorer than the UK, and some of them beneficiaries of foreign aid, that do not support the case for supporting Ukraine. It is our task to convince those countries to follow us on Ukraine, to defeat Russian tyranny. Do you think we're going to have any hope or influence if we're not at the table on their priorities of climate change, on how to mitigate and adapt to climate change? If we're not at the table, we have no hope of projecting our influence. And so I think there is a very strong strategic case now for foreign aid. And you will see David Cameron actually has changed his own language about making the case for foreign aid from it being a moral cause, which Tom has talked about and I think is very hard to prosecute in the public, to one of being in our strategic interests, because if we're not there, guess who's stepping in? China and Russia.
And do you think that scrapping the Department for International Aid and rolling it into the Foreign Office actually helps with that strategic approach?
I think it is good to align the objectives of where you want to spend your foreign aid, how you want to spend it. So I think the shift that we have seen to sustainable finance, for example, debt relief, I think these are really smart strategic examples of foreign aid. In Australia, we had an instance where China wanted to build a fibre cable undersea to the Solomon Islands. Now, that would have been a backdoor to Australian data. So what did Australia do? It partnered and actually paid for a cable out of the aid budget itself. Does anyone think that's a bad spend? Anyone in this room? Right, so we can all agree there are strategic reasons to spend. So I don't actually think it matters whether that is inside a different department, but I would say that we call it WASAID now, it was AusAid in the Department of Foreign Affairs, it's now been rolled into DFAT. I would say that they're two different skill sets, so it's important to keep those skill sets contemporary for wherever you've rolled that into. One is project management and system rollout. The other, of course, is diplomacy, and they're two different priorities.
Okay. Thank you very much. Emily, make the case for British taxpayers.
Yes, well, I think that's an important case to make. When this question comes up, when I'm presenting on GB News, as you might imagine, there are many, many emails that come flooding in saying charity should start at home. And yes, there are many ways in which international aid, foreign aid, can help in terms of alleviating poverty, in terms of education, in terms of public health, in terms of awareness, and in terms of our strategic and soft power. But as with any government department, there is waste. And I think we see that quite a lot when it comes to international development. And I would disagree about the target necessarily being a good thing, because I think if you have an arbitrary target set in law for a government department to spend 0.7, 0.5% of GDP on one area, then it's almost carte blanche for Whitehall and ministers to try and find that much to spend on. So I think there is, if you're trying to reach a target and you have to reach that target, you may well end up wasting more than if you chose projects based on a case-by-case basis, were strategic with it, and assessed the merits of each project case by case. So I think there is an issue with waste. I think there's also a lack of trust among a lot of British taxpayers. They don't trust that the government is best placed to decide some of these things. We see reports of £50 million being sent to China to spend on foreign aid, international development, and it can cover things like rice production, reducing the amount of salt in your food. And yes, these get picked up by the media, but I think it is a good thing that they do, because I do worry that we waste money. And when it comes to spending more at home, I guess the context is that unfortunately we have a lot of people going without in this country. So I can certainly see the argument that it is the government's job, the UK government's job, to prioritise British people first and foremost, and get our own home in order before signing up to arbitrary targets. That's not to say that it is not a massive place for humanitarian aid and international development, specifically when it goes hand in hand with our foreign policy goals. But I don't like the idea of a target because it's an encouragement to spend that much, come what may, and it may not be fitting for future years. Future governments shouldn't be held to that, in my view.
Okay, thank you very much. Ryan, why don't you take the floor?
Sure. Well, look, I think charity absolutely has to start at home. If your own house is on fire, the last thing anyone expects you to do is run across the road and help your neighbour. But the big question we should be asking ourselves is, why should charity end at home? The UK has the world's 6th largest economy. We're a member of the G7. We have a seat on the Security Council. We're one of the largest shareholders at the World Bank. We've led Europe in supporting Ukraine after the invasion of Russia. So the idea that we cannot afford to help people out at home and help people out overseas is a nonsense. We might not be willing to do it, but that's a choice. We absolutely have the means to do so. Now, I support overseas aid for 2 simple reasons. First of all, if I was living in desperate poverty, if I didn't know if my children might live through the night, if I thought my wife might die in childbirth, if I was afraid that the police might come in the middle of the night and take me away, I'd hope and pray that someone somewhere, especially in a wealthy country like ours, might give a damn and that they might actually help. Because it is a complete fluke of geography that it's them and not us. The second reason is this. It's in our national interest to give overseas aid. There's a general in the US called Jim Mattis. He was in the US Marines and he served Donald Trump as Defense Secretary. This is a man so right-wing, he'd frighten GB News. I mean, this is how scary this guy is. And he said to a congressional hearing, the less you spend on aid, the more I have to spend on bullets. And I asked myself, why do we wait until states fail before helping them out, when we know that the consequences of state failure end up on our shores, whether that's Al-Shabaab in Eastern Africa, the biggest international terror threat to the UK mainland at this time, or the example of Afghanistan, which we all know really well. And look, I didn't vote to leave the EU so that we could turn inward. I don't remember after 9/11 the British people turning around to the Americans and saying, sorry lads, things are tight, charity starts at home. Of course not. We stood shoulder to shoulder with them because that is the British way, which means it's the conservative way as well. And, you know, the big challenge of our time will be how we tackle global poverty. This is it. This is for our generation to solve. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that we do everything. That's completely unrealistic. But we should do what we can. And overseas aid is one of the best ways of doing that.
Is there a risk of a slight conflation of what we're talking about? If we're talking about, you know, helping out in Ukraine and helping out our American friends and all of this kind of stuff, to me that doesn't seem to make the case for aid, rather something else. The types of projects that overseas aid delivers are something else altogether. So when you make your case very powerfully, is there a slight danger of conflating sort of huge global issues with discrete overseas aid projects?
No, I don't think so at all. I think one of the mistakes that's been made over the past 20 years is to see aid as a niche sort of theme out on its own. When actually, if you talk to ambassadors around the world, UK ambassadors, they will say that development, defence, diplomacy are like three legs of the same stool. If you chop one of them off, it makes the other two much harder. So actually what's happening in Ukraine links with what's happening in places like Africa. I mean, look at the resolution in the UN to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So many African nations didn't support it. You know, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. But the idea that what's happening in Ukraine is separate to what's happening in the global south is simply not the case. So they're linked, they're intrinsically linked. And the point I make is it's not just the moral case, it's in our national interest. So we do overseas aid because we don't want the consequences of failed states to land on our shores. We support the Ukrainian people because we recognise that they're on the front line against Russia. So I don't see them as separate.
But, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think military assistance for Ukraine was coming out of the international development budget.
No, but the refugee cost for the Ukrainian people is. So, again, another direct link.
Well, I think also when you talk about Afghanistan too, I mean, I've got it here. The government's aid watchdog looked into the £3.5 billion of aid that was being given to Afghanistan between 2000 and 2020, and they found that it was massively implicated in corruption and waste. So I think when we're looking at where our aid money is going, the British people aren't stupid and they understand there's going to be an element of waste. They also worry about corruption. So I guess it's how can the government ensure that our money is being spent when it's spent with big charities, when it's spent with organisations, when it gets into the hand of potentially corrupt governments, how it is spent on actually alleviating poverty, how it is spent on making those countries better than they were before. And some people aren't completely convinced that it always does that. And there is some evidence to suggest that it does not. And I think when it comes to alleviating poverty, is it foreign aid that has alleviated poverty? Because if you look at many countries around the world, it is far more trade liberalisation, free trade, business, etc., that has lifted billions of people out of poverty in the last few decades. So, yes, foreign aid, I worry that sometimes foreign aid is a bit of a sticking plaster, can sometimes be used as a virtue signalling by governments. For example, David Cameron, he got a big pat on the back by raising it to 0.7%. But, I worry about where the money's being spent and whether it's effective enough.
So, do you mind if I just throw Tom or Latika, do you want to come in on this?
Look, I do think we have an obligation, and when I was talking about the Rohingya camp visits that I made, but there's a moral argument for why we should give more aid to somewhere like the Rohingya camp. But of course, that also links into national self-interest as well in terms of a relationship with an incredibly important country. So I wasn't for a moment saying that those two things weren't both at work at the same time. And I completely agree with the point about the 0.7 target. But my primary responsibility is towards my constituents. My primary responsibility is to stand up to my constituents and to fight for their interests. And I think it's important we also recognise that a certain amount of the international aid budget at the moment is being used on asylum hotels. And I think we can't have this debate without having a broader argument about illegal migration. And clearly a way in which we can hopefully stop some of the flows of things like the small boats is actually through international aid being spent in the right way. But I think it's a very real sense that actually a lot of those individuals who are coming over to our country illegally, having travelled through multiple safe European countries, are pulling resources away from some of the most desperate people in the world.
Okay, Latika?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of agreement here, actually, and I think from the applause to Ryan's contribution, there's actually a lot of agreement in the room. I think what we're narrowing down to is the issues that Emily raises, waste. I don't think anyone agrees that aid money should be wasted. I don't think anyone wants to see it prop up corruption either. But that's not the reason not to have a foreign aid program or fund it properly and well and align that with your strategic and foreign policy goals. That's simply a case to make sure that you have the appropriate guards in place to make sure it's spent properly. So that's just a matter of administration and governance, which I think is not outside the wits of the British state. But I had a look at actually what the UK wants to spend its aid money on. And I'm going to run through them because I think they're pretty important to note because we should all be on the same page here. So there's $8 billion of reliable investment. So this is just literally loans and financing. 745 million to empower women and girls. As a country that gave the world 3 female leaders and all of them being conservative, I think that's a pretty important goal for you guys to back. Humanitarian assistance actually comes down to only 3 billion. 11.6 billion in climate change. And I really want to stress how important climate change is as a conversation in terms of the aid debate. When you come to countries in my region, in the Indo-Pacific, that is their primary concern. Do not go and talk to them about Russia and Ukraine if you can't talk to them first about that they're sinking and how can you help them survive as an island state, because that's their priority and they will shut the door on you if you want to have a conversation about anything else first. So that's, I think, a really important priority that the UK has outlined. And finally, health aid. This is a country that gave the world the AstraZeneca vaccine at cost. This is a country that just overnight developed a malaria vaccine that is going to be made by India and rolled out across Africa and save hundreds of millions of lives. These are huge, proud achievements. This is a country I'm so proud to be joining this year. You guys should be celebrating this. These are huge, soft power, tangible, meaningful contributions that you are making to the world. And you can do these through your foreign aid program. You can have influence and you can be present on the stage.
If only there was more of that optimism at a conference more generally, that'd be nice.
Could I?
No, sorry, Tom.
Yeah. I think there's a reality here about trying to take the public with us. It's very hard, to take the public with us on these sorts of arguments when I have constituents who over the last year or so have been struggling to put food on the table, struggling to pay their energy bills, and they can look at a 4-star hotel across the road where people are being put up, getting 3 meals a day, getting access to a GP when they want it. And I'm sorry, you've got to take the public with you. Okay? I'm not going to stand here and deliberately just try and make everyone clap in this room by virtue signalling. My responsibility is for my constituents. And it's really hard to make these arguments about international aid when we have what's happening with the small boat crisis. It's making a mockery of the system and a mockery of our compassion.
I think that the problem is, though, it's not really an either or. The question is, these are things that Britain is capable of doing both at the same time.
Well, it's not when it's pulling resources from the international aid budget.
I agree with you. And so the Small Boats Challenge is something that is blighting Europe, it's blighting the UK. It has been an issue for my country for a decade or more. I understand that, but that doesn't mean it's a reason to close the door on one part of your foreign policy aspect and say, oh no, we can't do that because we've got a trouble over here. A grown-up country can manage to do both.
I just want
Well, that is true, and I do agree with you. In an ideal world, we'd have billions to spend on absolutely everything. But I think it is fair that Tom raised. I think when this conversation comes up, people say it's never either or, because people say things like we've got homeless veterans on the street, sleeping rough, homeless. At the same time, we're sending millions to Chinese development programs and to other countries
Chinese
around
aid
the world.
was actually ended under Raab.
No, I know, but in 2021-22, nearly 50 million pounds went to China and other countries, of course. So I think it is fair that people question where the trade-offs are. And if we scrapped an arbitrary target, would money be then put towards other causes? And that's a question for government, because at the moment you have quite a lot of Conservative MPs who in private will say, oh yeah, I'd like to cut the international development budget, the foreign aid budget, and concentrate the money at home. I'm just wondering why Britain is expected, and this is a question, why is Britain expected to spend so much more of their GDP on international development foreign aid than other nations? I believe New Zealand spends about 0.24 or something like this, and Switzerland pays a very small percentage. I wonder why Britain has to be number one or number two.
Ryan.
Look, let's take on the corruption issue first of all, because it's really, really important. And no one's more upset with corruption than people who actually work in the aid sector, because we see the people who desperately need it. So when we uncover money being misspent, it hurts us doubly hard. But look, on corruption, overseas aid is the most scrutinised government spending there is. So let's look at who scrutinises it. The Foreign Affairs Committee, the Public Accounts Committee, the International Development Committee, the Independent Committee on Aid Impact, Taxpayers Alliance, the IEA, GB News, Daily Mail, The Sun. Every single time any money is misspent, it is rightly called out. And I support that. And I've always supported those newspapers and groups who've gone after it, because it's absolutely the right thing to do. But I think there's a risk that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. If we abolished the MOD budget every time there was a procurement scandal, there'd be no army left. So we have to keep things in perspective. The vast majority of aid is incredibly well spent. I think on Tom's point about cost effectiveness, he's absolutely right to be furious at the aid money that's being spent on dealing with the consequences of small boats. But the sick thing is, that money that we spend, currently according to the Home Office, £7 million a day, which was over £3 billion in 2022, that isn't even getting to the root cause of the problem. That's like paying for plasters instead of identifying the wound and treating it. So it makes far more sense to spend money on overseas aid, stop people from leaving their country of origin, and many of them don't want to come anyway, rather than deal with the consequences. And look, I'm a Conservative. I want to control immigration. I want those boats to stop as well. But how's that working out? We're spending millions and millions of pounds each week, and we're not even getting to the root cause of the problem. And just finally, on the point 7, look, I make no apology for wanting the UK to be a leader in the world. I think that's absolutely right. And I've used historical analogies already, but we've stood alone in Europe twice in the last century. We've led the way, as Latika has said, on responding to COVID. We've led Europe outside the EU in responding to the invasion of Ukraine. I make no apology for wanting us to be a leader in aid as well. I think that justifies our seat on the Security Council, and it justifies us believing rightly that we still have a global role to play.
I would add to that, I was a reporter in Australia when David Cameron led the 0.7. And this was at a time where Australia was savagely cutting its aid budget. And in 2007, it was a coalition or a Tory government, and the Labor opposition leader, Kevin Rudd, at the time, actually campaigned very strongly on raising Australia's aid contribution to 0.5%. And he was elected with a landslide. So I actually do think there is, I'm not saying that was the only factor in the election campaign, of course, but I do think there is a public case, and the public are open to this, pending all of Emily's concerns, of course. The other thing I'd say is that after that was cut savagely in Australia, our aid budget, we looked to countries like the UK and we saw a Conservative government changing the narrative about what aid could do and how it can help project a country's influence on the global stage. And that was important and it was noticed. So sometimes you might think here what you're having are virtue signalling debates, but actually they do cast wider around the world. And that was a very positive contribution, I think. Now, I'm actually not as wedded to 0.5 or 0.7. I do think it's good to have a target that is sustainable, that can command the most consensus you could hope to achieve across the Commons, so that it doesn't then get cut and swung around by governments that change. And the beauty of tying it to GNI, gross national income, is that if your economy shrinks, so does the aid budget. You actually don't have to be cutting and chopping if you get into difficult fiscal times, because the aid budget will naturally contract. So it is worth tying it to GNI, I think, just for that reason.
Any final comments before we go to the...
Yeah, just I would like to, hear from the panel about results. What type of aid projects work, which ones don't? Should they be smaller and more focused, or more grandiose schemes? Is that where the waste happens? Which types of program work? Is it giving money to charities that then work in those countries? Are officials involved enough in the actual processes that go on in these countries? Because I think that's the main concern for me, is if we're paying all of these billions of pounds to countries around the world to help with poverty alleviation, public health, etc., want to know it's working, and I'm not always convinced it is.
Ryan, why don't you jump in on that one?
Yeah, of course. Well, look, this is the debate we should be having. Where do we spend the money? And that's a great debate to have, and that's, it should be political, not necessarily party political, but it should be political. Do we spend what is still a limited budget rightly? We can't do everything. Do we prioritise girls' education? Do we prioritise mine clearance? Do we try and prevent conflict? Do we vaccinate as many people as we possibly can? And that's something that has chopped and changed over the years. The government are going to produce a white paper, I think in November. We're going to set out a strategy for what the plan is for the next few years. Look, I've seen mine clearance work in Lebanon. I've seen farmers who are able to grow their own crops again on land which has been reclaimed. So that's not just preventing children from being in awful explosions, but it's equipping local people with the resources they need to stand on their own 2 feet. Everything that, as Conservatives, we believe, right? Don't just give someone a handout, help them up and let them get on with it. So there's lots of examples of where aid works. I will try and find agreement with other panellists by saying this. I think some NGOs, not all, but some in the past have been guilty in their marketing methods of perpetuating this image of poverty, which, while still very much in existence, is not quite the same as it was maybe 20 years ago. And that can lead people to believe, particularly at Christmas when you put the TV on and they have those appeal adverts, that nothing has changed. And that's something that I know the international development sector is working to address, and many no longer do that. But we have to be better at selling what works and showing the achievements. And I don't think, I include myself in this, we've not always got that right.
Okay, Latika, then Tom, and then we'll go out to the floor.
I totally agree with Ryan's last observation there. For me, where would we spend aid money? Infrastructure. There's a reason why China is doing Belt and Road. And if we're not having a say in these issues, they will beat us. So it's as clear as that. And I'm not saying that we should try and compete with them dollar for dollar. China's got huge issues domestically with its own Belt and Road spend, and they will see a lot of problems coming their way down this road too. But I think if we're going to be strategic about what we want from our aid budget, aligning it with our foreign policy goals and projecting British values and Western values around the world where we can hope to, then we need to be investing in infrastructure, because things like undersea cables, things like climate change adaptation and mitigation measures will help these countries help themselves. They will get richer, they will get more prosperous, they will trade with us, they will like us, and hopefully they will listen to us.
Tom.
I'm just on this point about the illegal migration issue, because it is very much connected to this debate. We could spend 5% of our GDP on international aid, and you wouldn't stop the small boats. The reason why small boats are still coming is because we don't have a workable deterrent. End of. And in terms of like me going to my constituents and saying to them, you should be proud of your country for this, they decide what makes them proud of their country. I don't tell them why they should be proud of their country. And actually, a lot of them aren't as proud of their country as they ought to be. And some of that is because I think we've become a soft touch and we don't do enough to stand up for our own national self-interest.
Right, we covered an awful lot in that short space of time, but I'm sure we can cover quite a deal more from the floor. So if you raise your hands, we've got a gentleman just in the front row, well, third row, sorry. If you could just say your name and if you're addressing the question to a specific person.
Okay, I'm Alok Mitra from Watford. I actually agree with Latika in terms of China, and it is important for us to be able to counter that. But I also agree with a lot of what Emily is saying, that one of the problems is that the budget that's spent is not fully explained to people, and therefore they don't fully understand. And a lot of it is investment, which actually helps British jobs and wealth in this country, which people don't understand. And in regards to Tom, the small boats is irrelevant to the budget. That needs to be sorted out at source. Now, the fact that the government can't find a workable solution is their problem, not the international aid, I would say. And so my point is that we ought to be very clear and transparent about where the money is going and why it's being spent, because that will get better understanding from the people.
Okay, Ryan, if you just quickly address that. I know that Dev Tracker is actually one of the more transparent bits of government spending, but how can that sort of be communicated to people in a better way?
Well, I think, let's be honest, we've had international development secretaries over the past 6-7 years who I don't think really believe in international development. So we've had a real problem with ministers being proud about what we're doing. Perhaps they've taken Tom's point of view that they think their voters and constituents aren't interested, so they want to keep it quiet. But I think we've got in Andrew Mitchell a minister now who really believes in it, who's passionate about it, and who is making those arguments and is saying this is what we're spending it on, this is how it works. And I think we need more of that. And look, Tom's absolutely right in his comments. The constituents are the ones in charge. And take what I'm about to say with a pinch of salt, because Tom won his last election and I lost mine. But you know, it was Mrs. Thatcher who said you can't lead from the crowd. You know, you have to get out in front sometimes, and you have to, you know, if you believe in something, say it. And not everyone will come with you, but some will. And I think those politicians who do care about this need to be bolder and need to be equipped with what they need so that their convictions can come out.
It is a tough sell at the moment, though, the aid budget. It really is, because I completely get where you're coming from, and if you're seeing fantastic results on the ground and poverty alleviation, very hard to disagree that that is not a good thing for Britain to be doing. But it is hard when people are genuinely struggling in this country and they see something that feels totally irrelevant to their daily life and their own interests. And they see, not to be rude, people like you saying, you know, it's fantastic, Britain needs to be leading the world, we need to be doing this, that and the other, and, you know, it's not either or, and, you know, this is fantastic. But the reality of daily life in this country is very different for many people, and a lot of people couldn't care less really about that. And, you know, they want more going to them. I mean, we can't even get a train line up to Manchester. I mean, you know, I'm talking about infrastructure projects in African countries and, you know, across the world. So I think there needs to be a little bit more down-to-earth speak when we're talking about international aid if it's going to be sold to the public.
I'll let Ryan respond and then pass along.
Do
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's borne out in the polling. But I push back against it a bit. Look, I live on a council estate in where I live, and that's very much my background. And I've always been surprised by this idea that development is a middle-class obsession. And I can see why people think that. Whenever there's positive things about aid or positive arguments, they tend to be in The Guardian. They tend to be sort of Guardian reading.
To be fair to The Guardian, they've done a lot of reporting on waste.
Yeah, they have.
And corruption and things.
It tends to be Corbynista, upper middle class, virtue signalling, people who make some of these arguments, which doesn't help. But if you look at big NGOs like CAFOD, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, their supporters, which number about 30,000, tend to come from blue-collar backgrounds. And the same could be repeated for Oxfam, Save the Children, Christian Aid, organisations like that. And so I always think this idea that it's a middle-class obsession is wide of the mark.
There's a difference there. People putting their hand in their own pocket and deciding which charity they want to give money to. I mean, people give billions out of their own pocket to charities that they choose. It's different when you're asking, the government to select what matters to the British people. That's where I think it goes awry a little bit.
I think you have to face the realities as they come to you, not what we wish. And the truth is there is a very big strategic competition underway in the world. And Britain does need to have a role in that. And I think British people do want to have a role in that. I moved here in 2016. I did not hear a country that was wanting to leave the EU to turn inward. I heard a country wanting to leave the EU so it could go and do things its own way, in a bigger, broader, better way. And that's the country I think you still are today. To use the example I raised earlier about that cable in the Solomon Islands, now that was after the context of Australia savaging its aid budget for years and years and years. When that announcement was made, there was not an eyelid batted because it's such common sense. It was such an alignment of our strategic and security goals that the Australian public trusted the government had made a good decision on its behalf, spending taxpayer dollars, yes, for something that was in everybody's interests. And so I think, yes, we don't want to see waste. We have to align these things with our strategic objectives. But I'm very confident that governments can make that case to the public and that the public is receptive to them.
Tom?
I think that the international aid debate and the illegal migration bill are linked, and they are linked in the minds of millions of people in this country. And Emily's right, it does make it a really tough sell when we are spending billions of pounds on the consequences of illegal migration to then, in addition to that, say, oh, and by the way, we want to take even more money from the public purse to spend on international aid. The two things are linked, and they make it much, much harder to sell to the public the case for international aid. And also, from my experience, having 75,000 constituents, they do think that. In terms of the, there's a bit of a contradiction here, because many of the same people who are saying more and more in international aid, more and more in international aid, are amongst those holding the most liberal attitudes when it comes to tackling the small boats crisis, which works against our ability as a country to invest in international aid. If and when we get a workable deterrent and we can tackle the small boats crisis, I'll be up for all of the money that was spent on the small boats being spent on international aid. How about that? That's a deal. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll open out for more questions now. There's a gentleman just next to you, Ben.
Thanks very much. Daniel Thornton from Gavi, which funds immunisation in lower-income countries. So, Ryan, I was really pleased to hear you include immunisation in your list of, at least for discussion, potentially effective aid projects. So, my question's really for Latika, and it's a kind of leading question, in the way of these things. So, immunisation is, and Gavi has saved 17 million lives since it was set up, with UK as our biggest donor since 2000. We're well scrutinised. Bill Gates was also part of the process, and he's a pretty tough businessman, as you'll be aware. Just checking whether any of his team are in the room. But they scrutinise us pretty hard on how we spend our money. It's a matter of protecting the UK as well, because if you don't have good immunisation systems around the world, it's very hard to tackle pandemics, and pandemics do come across borders. So I guess I'd make the case that that's a pretty important infrastructure that maybe doesn't consist of bricks and mortar, but is nonetheless vital for UK interests. Do you agree?
Okay, just before you answer that, if you could just pass the microphone to the right and we'll take the second question just to bunch them up.
Isn't part of the problem with foreign aid not just how much we spend, but some of the often absurdly lofty ambitions that come with it? So, for example, the UK taxpayers gave £1.6 million to a project called Peace and Reconciliation in Sudan, which aimed to address the root causes of the ongoing conflict, and it wasn't long after that the country descended again into civil war. So isn't the problem that actually, rather than directing it towards humanitarian projects where a difference could be made, we have these just absurd, lofty ambitions that end up going disastrously wrong?
That's Elliot from the Taxpayers Alliance, by the way, just to frame that question. So we've got two there. Latika, why don't you pick up the point on immunisations, and then we'll maybe hand over to Ryan for the second question.
In answer to your question, absolutely. Sorry, I should have added that in my infrastructure answer, but I thought I made it clear when I talked about AstraZeneca and the malaria vaccine, and that is actually going through Gavi, the malaria vaccine work. Yes, I think vaccine diplomacy is huge. It's so important, and it would be an incredible contribution and legacy for Britain if it is able to solve or help solve or wipe malaria off the map. I mean, how many countries can say this? It's phenomenal. It's tremendous. So yes, I absolutely believe health should be a huge priority for foreign aid. Absolutely, no doubt about it. I just think that was a given. Sorry.
Ryan, why don't you pick up the second question?
Yeah, look, I think the project that you listed sounds really good. Look, we're about going after the hardest to reach challenges. We don't go after the low-hanging fruit. What's the point? We want to go after the hardest to reach. We don't want to tackle the easy problems. We're British. We're here to do a job. We're here to lead. We're here to do what needs to be done. And if that had worked, imagine the number of lives that would have been saved. I think you've got a point. We probably ought to be more strategic in how we spend aid. And as I mentioned earlier, there's been lots of chopping and changing and things like that. But I thought that project sounded pretty good, I have to say.
I would also add in there, it is important to fund NGOs. And if you look at Belarus, for example, where the UK has been an important funder of NGOs there, nobody could say that's a waste of money to support civil society organisations trying to fight the Belarusian regime. Does anyone think that's about investment? Right.
All right.
It's hard to say, though, because if you're investing something, you want to know what your rate of return is, as it were. So, the odds of it having the impact you want, positive. That needs to be taken into account because it is taxpayers' money fundamentally. So if you're going to invest it, you want to know what the chances of getting the outcome you want are and whether it's worth it.
Is there a problem with language there? People often call government spending investment. Thanks, Gordon Brown. But we always talk about investment. It's just public spending, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's a form of public spending, but but we're talking about international development, it needs to have, you want a positive outcome from the money spent. So that's why I'm using the word investment, because you're investing for hopefully a positive outcome.
Emily, I think you've hit on the exact problem with a lot of this debate. It's very hard to really quantify and draw metrics from some of this spending and some of these programs and come out and say 6 months later, here's what we achieved. 1 civilian was saved from being jailed in Belarus. Well, of course we can't say those things. But we know innately that they're good programs and we can see long-term benefits from investments like that. Some aid projects are simply just not going to be as possible to come back with a metric in 6 or 12 months' time. By their very nature, it's like trying to measure the value of British soft power. It's really difficult to do. But do you see many countries where the national flag is kind of a sexy symbol to wear? No. It's really Britain that's got that uniquely. So these are things you do have to keep investing in, even if you can't draw a tangible metric from them 12 months down the line.
Okay, there are lots of hands now. There's a lady at the back and then the lady just in front of her as well.
Hello, I'm Julie, I work for ActionAid, which is a charity. And I've been hearing the arguments on the British public and kind of how difficult it is to take the public with us. But I do think the British public are with us. I think British people are fundamentally quite compassionate and caring people. We see that in the amount of money that is given to charity, cross-party, cross-socioeconomic background. And I think, I just don't think we should be kind of talking about taxpayers and constituents as if they are people who don't want an ODA budget. I think they do want an ODA budget. And, I also hear about people struggling in the UK, but I don't think the struggles come fundamentally from 0.5% of GNI going to ODA. And when it comes to waste and corruption, Ryan talked on it a bit, but these funds are so heavily scrutinised, more than I think any other budget. I've worked in small charities, large charities, even FCGO and DFID fund managers, and every single penny is scrutinised as to where this has gone and how it has been spent and how it, justifies value for money. Also on 0.5, if we should have a cap, if we should have a budget, I think if we're going to start, sorry, I will get to my question. But if we're going to kind of get rid of the ODA budget and start investing in things that are worth value, we would spend more than 0.7%. It is truly a cap in terms of what we think is justifiable. So, anyways, my question is for Emily. I think a lot of the questions Tom was talking about questions that he has from his constituents, and also a lot of what you were saying about, you know, what has been successful. Like, it's hard to measure. There's so much research and so much proof of how charities have spent the ODA really well and have made a big difference. So how come that's not getting a bigger platform and a bigger voice? And then that would also help constituents with justification.
Great. Let's pass the microphone forward a couple of rows.
Hi, I'm Amy. I work for United Against Malnutrition and Hunger. Just on the gentleman's point over here about peace and reconciliation in South Sudan, I actually visited a peace and reconciliation project in northern Uganda, which was funded by UK Aid and which was being managed by World Vision UK. And I met young people who were from different ethnic backgrounds who were saying that they no longer wanted war, they wanted peace, and they were committed to working together across ethnic tribes in the future. So although that's not going to stop an outbreak of war tomorrow, in a generation's time, those are the future leaders of the country. So yeah, that's a lofty ambition, but one I think we should be really proud of. And that's, my question is really about the pride. So my first engagement with politics was when I wrote to Sir Graham Brady, who was my MP in Altrincham and Sale West, and asked him about the 0.7 vote. And his reply was full of pride for the Conservative government that were going to bring in 0.7. And he knew that 0.7 was an international commitment. He knew the reasoning behind it. It was, defined at the UN. It was a coalition of countries across the world that were committing to this, and he was proud of that. So I guess my question is, where has that pride gone? The Conservatives used to be the champions of this, and now that has disappeared. I don't think that's because aid's got less effective. Something else has changed. So I guess for Ryan and Tom, where has that pride gone?
Okay, Tom, do you want to pick up probably both of those points from Julia and Amy, talking about taking the public with you, and then where's the pride?
I mean, I don't doubt there aren't individuals in my constituency and individuals all over the country who would rather we spend a lot more money on international aid. There are, of course, going to be some people who think that. But all of the polling, every bit of polling I've ever seen on this issue, doesn't show majority public support for drastically increasing international aid and taking money from other major domestic priorities, international aid. I mean, if you've got some polling on that I haven't seen, I'm all ears. I mean, in terms of this other point about a pride, to an extent, my views on this are quite nuanced. Okay, you probably get some colleagues of mine who might be, even more sceptical of international aid than I am. But, I'm on a panel today with, two representatives who are incredibly pro international aid, and I kind of think I owe it to my constituents who are sceptical about this to raise questions about their views on this. Okay, I'm not somebody who hasn't seen the benefits of international aid. I have. I've seen, girls' money spent, British taxpayers' money spent on girls' education in Bangladesh, for example, and I've met some of the girls, and I've spoken to them about what it meant for them to do that, and how their life has been transformed from that. And I do want us to have a role in doing as much of that as possible, pragmatically, in a cost of living crisis. So it's not that I'm not proud of it, but I also think there's a lot of my constituents who, frankly, when they see things, they want us to have a role in the world, but they also want us to frankly, put them first, and they want us to stand up for our national self-interest. And I think often we haven't done so, and we've become a soft touch. So we've got to get that balance right.
We'll just run along. We'll do Latika and then move across.
So I've just come back from Japan, and I visited an earthquake memorial museum in Sendai. It was the site of the 3/11 earthquake, March 2011. And when I walked into that museum, there are 2 Australian flags at the entrance. And I was like, what is this? Why is our flag here? And it turns out we were the first aid contributors when that earthquake happened and the tsunami happened. We were the first country to send rescuers, and we were the first, had our first world leader visit there. That is remembered a decade on, to the point where they want to display our flags to every single visitor who walks through that institution. They're not seeing a British flag, they're not seeing an American flag, they're seeing an Australian flag. And what does that say? It says that this is a country that is here for you in your time of need. And sometimes those things are immeasurable. You cannot ever put a number on how much that means to somebody, or what that did to somebody down the line, or how that affected their view of your country. but it's there and it absolutely generates pride, and it should. And if Britain was proud of its aid spending and you had similar programs like that around the world, you should be plastering the British flag everywhere. You should be putting it on vaccines that go to people. Every needle should have a British flag on it, because that's the truth of what your aid is doing. It's delivering what Britain wants to the rest of the world.
All right, Ryan?
To Amy's point, I think it comes down to a much bigger problem in our politics. It's not just about aid. There's a lack of conviction among politicians, particularly at senior levels. I think back to when Margaret Thatcher was trying to reform the British economy in the 80s. It was very, very unpopular. It was unpopular with her colleagues, never mind the general public, but she believed that it was the right thing to do, and therefore she stuck with it. I think going to David Cameron, equal marriage wasn't very popular at the time, especially not in the grassroots of the Conservative Party. He thought it was the right thing to do, so he did it. Tom and I supported a leave vote in the EU referendum. That wasn't very popular in certain areas of the country, and even within our own party, particularly with the leadership at the time, we believed it was the right thing to do, so we did it. And I think, if I may, I think too many people in politics, it's not just elected politicians, it's lots of people in politics, spend too much time on Twitter and not enough time thinking through what do we actually believe and how are we prepared to make the arguments in favour of what we believe. And I think if we could get back to that, then I think those of us who care passionately about things like international development will be heard and respected a lot more, even if people disagree with us.
Emily?
Yeah, I think the British people are fantastically generous, which is why so many people choose, as I said, to give money personally to the charities that they value and the charities that they think they see results from. I think we, as individuals, spend about £4 billion a year, I think, on charity, on international charities. So I'm sure many people who give to ActionAid, give to ActionAid are hugely generous. That doesn't mean that you have to be in support of a 0.7% international development target, foreign aid target. I do actually think those things are different. You can worry about where the government priorities are and then actually, give to charities. I mean, like I do. I give my own money to charities that I think are actually beneficial and charities that I think are getting results and charities that I think aren't just there to make lots of money for the bosses. So, I think British people are very generous. I don't think you have to be a nasty person to be a little bit sceptical sometimes of arbitrary targets when it comes to international development. And I think that perhaps, sometimes priorities, and also I do just bear in mind the context of a lot of people in this country who are truly struggling, and the public finances are in a bit of a state, to say the least. So all of that.
Okay, we're getting close to the end, so we'll try and take as many questions as we possibly can. Harry, and then the gentleman in front as well.
Thank you. Just to shamelessly bring climate into this, I think it is actually quite relevant in the sense that increasingly around the world and in the UK, there's been aid money which is being diverted for climate change funds. Now, some of that is going on mitigation, which is maybe building solar panels and wind farms. Some of it is adaptation, which I think does have that greater benefit because you're talking about flood defences, things that can actually protect people. But is the panel concerned about climate change commitments detracting from what should be going to humanitarian aid spending? I think Rishi Sunak committed £11 billion, and is that coming from the aid budget?
All right, this gentleman here, thank you.
Thank you. By the way, I'm a great fan of the TPA, especially John O'Connell, who came to Southport Conservatives. I'm a member there, so Graham Jones. Thank you very much for coming. Really, this is for Tom, really. I've been reading, I went to a talk early on today where, well, I think it was Andrew Mitchell was speaking about international aid. And I think he mentioned that before we could have used our contributions for aid to cover our own costs for housing illegal migrants. I believe that will change once the Act comes into force. Is that the case? Because I honestly believe, and I'm sorry to have to say this, and I may upset people, but I think any money in the international aid programme should be used to reimburse all these housing costs we're having to pay at the moment for illegal migrants.
All right, just because we started a little late, we're actually going to take this third question and we'll get a good cycle of responses.
Thank you. Just picking up the point about lofty ambitions and failed states, do the panel think there is an argument to spend in areas like Jordan where the impact of the refugee crisis in a fairly fragile part of the world, to put it mildly, if we don't do something to support that country before it fails, and before it fails with that challenge, we as a country are going to be left with a far bigger problem to try and deal with.
Thank you. Sorry, didn't catch your name.
Sorry, Stuart Harper from Leeds.
Okay. Tom, why don't you pick up Graham's point on migration?
Well, that's the first I've heard of that. So I haven't heard that was going to be the case. Like, my view was that the cost of the asylum accommodation would continue to come from the international aid budget. Well, if there's a change there, I'm concerned about that. Yeah, I will. So I mean, because the question, Ben, is where's the money going to come from? If the money to pay for the asylum accommodation isn't coming from that budget, where's it coming from? Schools, health? I don't know, extra borrowing. So that's a concern for me. Plus, also, I think it's a very real. That does concern me. But I think it's important at that point about conviction. The reality is we are still giving 0.5 on international aid, which is actually far higher probably than. If you did a poll in my constituency about how much I'd want to be spent on it. I mean, frankly, there's a large number of my constituents who probably wouldn't want to spend anything on it, and that's the reality. And that's wrong, and I'd make the case to them about why they're wrong to think that. So I do make those arguments to people who have got the alternative view, but I just think we've also got to kind of listen to them as well. I think it's a balance. And I think that you're not hitting that balance when you're sort of overly lofty in your ambitions when it comes to aid without taking people with you.
Latika, Harry raised some points about climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I think I addressed this earlier, but climate change is a really important part of overseas development assistance, because that's where a lot of countries who are on the front line of climate change and are poor need the most help. They might not be hungry, but they might be sinking, and so they do need the assistance there. So I think that is also important, and from my perspective, I think this should always be aligned with your strategic objectives. And there's just so many countries where you cannot begin to have conversations with them if you're not talking about climate change and how they can adapt to it and how they can cope.
Okay, Ryan, do you want to pick up any, or maybe the point Stuart made on refugee crisis?
Yeah, sure. No, I think I know Jordan well. I've been there a couple of times. There are, I think, a third of the population of Jordan, roughly, is made up of Syrian refugees. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. So it sort of puts our crisis of small boats in perspective. I'm not saying it makes it meaningless, but we're talking millions and millions of refugees from Syria are in Jordan. So again, that's a really good, effective use of our aid budget. Better to support the Jordanians deal with refugees in their country than have those 3 million refugees try to come to Europe. I think that's really sensible, and it illustrates how effective our aid budget can be when it's strategic, when it works in line with our diplomacy as well.
Emily, any final thoughts from you on either the points raised or more generally?
I'm not sure I have anything to add, really. No.
I think you made your points quite clearly.
I made my
Fair
points,
enough.
yes.
Yeah, very good. All right, well, listen, my job of chairing that was really easy because that was done with a lot of passion, a lot of knowledge, and a lot of respect as well. So I had a really good time chairing that. So I want to say thank you to our friends at the Coalition for Global Prosperity and their hard-working team in helping us put this together. And most importantly, thank you all for coming today. And let's thank the panel in the usual way. Thank you.